The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors. It's coming. All these voices.
My name is James Hershey. Right back. That ought to do it. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Staring into the Abyss. I am your host, horror author James Hershey Jr., and with me as always, my co-host, old boy James Ash. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. How's everybody tonight?
On tonight's episode, we're going to talk about fairies, because St. Paddy's Day is coming up. So we're going to be talking about fairies and focusing probably mostly on the leprechauns. Now, a leprechaun is a type of fairy, and it is a solitary creature who is a shoemaker by trade. And each leprechaun has its own treasure, which is a pot of gold that's kept at the end of the rainbow, according to the legends. This gold supposedly comes from buried treasure that the leprechaun has found that armies buried in the ground of Ireland as they were marauding through and conquering. They would bury little stashes of treasure so that when they came back through, they could pick it back up and take it home. Well, according to the lore, the leprechauns found these treasures that were buried, and they took them for their own. And that's why they have a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Now, according to the lore, if you capture a leprechaun, then you can bargain with that leprechaun and trade the leprechaun's freedom for his treasure. Another variation of the lore says that a leprechaun will grant you 3 wishes if you capture it in order for you to let it free. And still another version, the leprechaun will offer you payment to be set free. That payment consists of either a silver coin or a gold coin. Now, the majority of people in the lore always choose the gold coin because gold is worth far more than silver. But see, a leprechaun is a trickster. That's the way it's known throughout lore, is as a trickster. So if you choose the gold coin, shortly after the leprechaun leaves, the gold coin turns to ash in your hand. So you're left with nothing. But if you choose the silver coin, the cool thing about the silver coin is that your coin purse, because that's what they carried back then, was little leather sacks that was called a coin purse. Your coin purse would always be full as long as you had that magic silver coin in it. You would never run out of money. So you could just keep on digging into the purse, pulling out more and more silver coins to pay for whatever you needed. So the lucky person that chose the silver coin instead of the gold would be granted an endless supply of money, basically. But there's almost no cases in the lore of anybody actually ever choosing the silver coin. It's always the gold coin, and it always turns to ash in their hands. Now, the image that we have of the leprechaun is the tall top hat, the buckles on the shoes, like 7 buttons going down the jacket, dressed all in green, gold buckles, and that's the image that we have. Little tiny red-haired leprechaun. But in the actual lore, they used to wear red instead of green. Green is a more modern version of the leprechaun. In the original lore, they always wore red. And the reason for that, which is kind of interesting, is solitary fairies, like the leprechaun, always wear red. And what they call the trooping fairies, which are fairies that gather together in a group, they always wear green. That's why, like Tinkerbell, for example, from Peter Pan, had on green, because she was a trooping fairy. Those tiny little kind of fairies gather together, and they travel in packs, basically. So they wear green, whereas a more solitary fairy, like the leprechaun, would always have on red. We look at leprechauns now like Lucky the leprechaun from the Lucky Charms box. They're kind of cute and fun-loving and fairly innocent and not very dangerous. But the leprechauns of the original lore were not cute and lovable. As a matter of fact, the majority of fairies from the original Irish folklore were not cute little Disney creatures, okay, like Tinkerbell. They were lustful, they were nasty, and they were just as likely to do horrible things to you as they were to delight you with their magic. It all depends on their mood, basically. If you upset them, if you make them angry, they would be very cruel to you. The legends of the leprechauns go all the way back to the 8th century. And in the 8th century, the legend goes that there were water spirits that were called lucherpan, and that meant small body. And those little water spirits merged with a household fairy that would haunt the cellars and would always drink up all your wine and everything and play really mean and horrible tricks on the family. Those two merged together. Now, the legend says they merged. It doesn't say whether they hooked up and had an offspring or how that merger took place, but they merged together and they created what is known as the leprechaun. That's why in the legend of the leprechauns, leprechauns are always drinking, and a lot of times they're drunk, and they like to play tricks on people. They're considered tricksters, and that's where you get those two, is that merger that took place in the 8th century. Now, a leprechaun will also deceive you whenever possible. They lie all the time. So you can never really trust what a leprechaun says, because like I said, he's a trickster. There's one legend that illustrates this pretty well, and it's kind of a cool little legend. It's about this guy who found a leprechaun. He caught a leprechaun, and he convinced the leprechaun that if the leprechaun showed him where his treasure was buried, then he would let the leprechaun go. So the leprechaun took him in this field over to this bush and told him that underneath this bush was where his treasure was buried. Now, the guy didn't have a shovel with him. So what the guy did was he took a red, one of his red garters that he was wearing, and he tied it around the bush where the leprechaun said the treasure was. And he ran back real quick to get a shovel, and he came straight back. Now, it only took like a minute or two to go grab a shovel and come back. By the time he got back, every single bush and tree in the entire field had a red garter tied around it. So he couldn't find the bush that the leprechaun said the treasure was buried under. So that's just a little illustration of how tricky they are and how they like to deceive you. Now, in the magical world, fairies and water spirits and pretty much all different creatures have a very distinctive sound that is associated with them. Entities like the fairy banshee, they emit like a mournful wail, and that lets you know they're there. So it's just like sad wailing sound. Now, the leprechaun, when it's in the area, you'll hear a tapping, because what that's supposed to be is a tapping of his little tiny hammer. Because remember, he's a shoemaker. So he has this little tiny cobbler hammer, and he's driving little bitty nails into shoes, is what the sound is. And that's how you know a leprechaun is around. You'll hear that tapping of his hammer. Now, a lot of people have tried to actually find leprechauns throughout history so that they can get that treasure or get the wishes. Because like I said, some legends say that they'll grant you 3 wishes, others say that they will trade their treasure for their freedom, and yet others will give you the choice between the gold and the silver coin. So a lot of people have tried to find leprechauns and capture them throughout history in order to get that treasure. See, leprechauns are very tricky, so you got to watch them every second, because one of the things a leprechaun can do is just instantly vanish. So as soon as you're not looking at it, it disappears. The leprechaun family is split into 2 different groups. Okay, you have the leprechauns, which we've been speaking of, and then you have a thing called a clurichaun, which is a form of leprechaun. A clurichaun is a lot more mischievous and a lot more dangerous than a leprechaun is. The clurichaun steals all the time. It calls it borrowing, because according to the clurichaun, it doesn't steal anything, it borrows everything. So it'll borrow all your stuff, it will create mayhem in your house, and during the nighttime, it will go down and raid your wine cellar or your bar and drink all your alcohol. It'll eat up all your food. They also do this really interesting thing where they will actually take a tiny saddle and harness, and they will put it on your dog or sheep or goats or chickens or whatever your pet is, cat, whatever. They will put a little saddle and a harness on it, and they will ride it all around the countryside. But that's basically what a leprechaun is. Now, that is the symbol of St. Paddy's Day for a lot of people. They think of the leprechaun. And it's just interesting how what leprechauns were in lore is different than what they are today, what we see them as. Because in lore, they were not a nice thing at all. They were, at best, mischievous and would play tricks on you. And at worst, they would really mess up your life. But that's one form of fairy. Like I said in the beginning, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of fairies. You have everything from a leprechaun to like the little Tinkerbell kind of fairy. Trolls are a type of fairy. There's so many different ones. Some of them are pretty harmless and pretty nice, and some of them are not so harmless and not so nice. One form of fairy is a troll, and trolls are never nice. They are always really, really terrible all throughout the lore. One thing that a troll does a lot of, and other fairies do as well, but mainly in the lore you hear of trolls doing this, is they will come in the night and they will steal your baby, and they will replace your baby with something that is called a changeling. Now, what a changeling is a little deformed or very unintelligent offspring of fairies. Sometimes elves, mostly fairies. And remember, I said a troll is classified technically as a fairy. So it is the offspring of the whatever fairy decides to switch it out that is either deformed or an imbecile, basically. And what they do is they come in the night and they take your child and they replace it with their child. And through magic, it appears to you as your own child. So when a human being looks at the child, they can't tell that it's not their child. They see their child when they look at it. But it's actually the fairy's child. Now they take these children, and most of the time they sell them to the devil. Or they keep the child, in rare cases, if it's a rather spectacular child. They will keep the child in fairyland, and eventually the child returns. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can get your child returned to you according to the lore. One is by making the changeling, which is the fairy's child, which you think is your child, making that changeling laugh. Another way is by torturing the changeling. Now, that belief that you could cause a changeling to leave and your child to come back by torturing it led to a whole lot of cases of real-life child abuse back in the olden days, of people thinking that their child was a changeling and torturing their own child. Now, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why this takes place. why fairies take your child and replace it with a changeling. One reason is to act as a servant. Okay? They use your baby as a slave to serve them in fairyland. Another reason is because they love human children. Now, both of those reasons are if they are planning on keeping the baby. The most popular reason is to sell the child to the devil to gain power for the fairies. Now, in rare cases, you don't end up with a fairy baby that is the changeling. You actually end up with an old fairy person. So like an elderly person, senior citizen of the fairies. They get swapped out for your kid instead. Now this is very interesting because it's almost like a fairy retirement plan. Basically the fairy lives his life, reaches an age where he's very, very old and he can't really take care of himself as well. So he gets swapped out for your baby as a changeling, and then for the rest of his days you take care of him until eventually he dies off. And then when he dies off, your baby dies basically, and it's all over. Now there's a couple different ways that you can supposedly keep this from happening to your baby. One way was to have an inverted coat where your baby sleeps, like a coat inside out. Another way is to have a pair of iron scissors left open where the child sleeps. These things were thought to ward off fairies so that they could not steal your baby and leave a changeling. I don't think it's probably a very good idea to have open scissors sleep with your baby. I mean, that's just me, but I think that's an accident waiting to happen. They would also, some people would just simply watch their children sleep and make sure that nothing happened to them. But I guess you can't really do that forever. Eventually, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Now, a little bit about what a changeling is and what a changeling does. Other than the fact that it's just horrible to think of someone taking your baby. That's bad enough. And replacing it with a little monster. But changelings are not exactly safe either. They have an insatiable appetite. They are absolutely ravenous. It starts off with food. They'll eat everything in sight. And in some cases in the lore, they took it a step further. After eating food and never being able to satisfy that hunger, eventually they turn to eating animals, like your pets, and then to eating other people, other children that they play with, and working their way up to eating the adults as well. So in some of the lore, they are very, very dangerous creatures. And it's a very, very bad thing to have a changeling in your home because they might eat you, basically, or eat your other children. In some of the lore, they weren't dangerous at all. See, that's the interesting thing about lore is there's a bunch of different versions a lot of times of these things. Now, I had said before that usually it was trolls that were responsible for stealing your babies and leaving changelings. That's the overwhelming majority of the lore. It's a troll that did it. Now, one reason that trolls would do this is because they believe that it's more respectable to be raised by humans, and they want to give their children the best upbringing they can. Because I guess even trolls love their kids, right? So they believe that it was better to be raised by a human than by the trolls, so they would swap out their babies so that their babies were raised by humans. So what they would do is they would sneak into the night and they would steal unbaptized children. Okay, this is one of the reasons that it was so important to get your child baptized as soon as possible back in the Middle Ages, because they believed that if you did not get your child baptized, then your child would not be protected against evil, and a troll would come in and steal your child and replace it with a changeling. So people tried to get their children baptized as soon as they could, because once the children had been baptized, they were part of the church. And once they were part of the church, the belief was that the trolls could not take them. Now, in the Scottish folklore, almost all the time the children were taken and they were sold to the devil. In the Irish folklore, the majority of the time they were sold to the devil, but sometimes the fairies would actually keep the children for whatever reasons that they had for doing that. Now, there's a lot of different beliefs in what fairies actually are. Some people say that they're ghosts, spirits of the dead. Some people say they were fallen angels. Other people say that they used to be gods, and they were demoted once Christianity came along. They were demoted down to the level of just fairies. That's another belief. And like I said, there's hundreds of these different kinds of fairies. Everything from brownies, hobgoblins, banshees, the leprechaun, goblins, bugaboos, all kinds of different creatures are considered fairies. I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in the lore that it said you can actually find fairies if you wanted to go look for them. One way is to look for fairy rings. Now, what a fairy ring is a circle of either plant life or other things that are found in nature. So it could be a circle of stones. It could be a circle of toadstools, like little mushrooms. It could even be just a spot in the yard where the grass is much greener in the shape of a circle. Because I've seen that as well, where there's just a circle of really dark grass and everything around it is light green, but that circle is extremely dark green. That's considered to be a fairy ring as well. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the people of Ireland, Scotland, England, and other places, they've all said that a circle in nature is where fairies dance. It's called a fairy ring. So if a fairy ring is in your yard, it's best not to disturb it. Because according to the lore, if you disturb a fairy ring, you anger the fairies that dance and play there. And as I spoke about earlier, fairies are not these cute little Disney creatures. They can be very, very dangerous. And if you anger them, best case scenario, they're going to play a bunch of really bad tricks on you and be annoying and really make your life a living hell for a while. Worst case scenario, they could kill you. There's also rings that are made up of trees. These are some of the larger fairy rings, to where there's actually trees that make a circle, and inside that circle is where the fairies dance and gather together and meet. Another warning about fairy rings is you're never supposed to actually step inside of a fairy ring. You're supposed to always walk around one. The reason for this is in the lore in Ireland, the people there say that a person that walks inside of a fairy ring could actually get stuck inside the fairy ring. There's different legends of people that have went into fairy rings to dance with the fairies and just keep on dancing until they died. Because once you started dancing inside that fairy ring with the fairies, you can never stop dancing. You're just going to dance until you drop dead. Because for whatever reason, magically, they keep you dancing and you just cannot stop even if you want to. And in some of the legends, people's friends have actually had to grab them and yank them out of the fairy ring to save their lives. I thought that was kind of interesting. Another place that you could find fairies is in wells and springs. This is especially popular in the Celtic lores. People would travel to these sacred wells all throughout Ireland. They would make like long trips throughout Ireland to get to these wells. And it was said that these wells were guarded by a bunch of different types of spirits, mostly fairies. To this day, it is thought that if you go to Ireland and you can find one of these old sacred wells, that it's very likely that you might actually find a real fairy that is still guarding the well. That is what is said. The fairies that guard these sacred wells and the sacred springs are almost always water fairies. Now, these fairies like to dance on top of the rocks and really like to watch nature. They like to sit there and just watch nature because they think it's really, really beautiful. So if you're actually looking for a fairy at a well or a spring, it's going to be a water fairy you're looking for. And what you want to do is to find the most beautiful part in the forest that's around that well or that spring, the most beautiful area, and just sit down there and wait. Some people will also leave offerings for the fairies. One thing that you can leave as an offering is cream. For whatever reason, fairies absolutely love cream. So if you leave cream for the fairy, then supposedly it will come out and it will enjoy the cream, and that's a good way to get on its good side. Because not all fairies are nice, like I said before. So if you find a fairy at a spring, it's a good thing if you brought an offering for it, and you don't want to disturb them when they're playing and having fun, because you might upset them, and then who knows what they're going to do to you. One thing people do is they set up those ponds or those really ornate water fountains in their own homes and their gardens, and they set it up and put a little stone circle there to kind of invite the fairies to come and visit and to stay. It works especially well for water nymphs if you set up a nice pond or a water fountain, because they love fountains and springs, and they like to go play in the water and splash around and stuff. One word of warning about the water nymph: according to lore, they will invite you to come into the water and play as well, but you got to be careful of that, because much like the fairy circle, the fairy ring, that you go into to dance with the fairies and you can't stop, it's kind of the same deal with the water nymph. If you go play and splash around in the water with it, it's very difficult to pull yourself away, and you can get stuck there. Another place that you can find fairies is in the hills and in the mountains. Now, these type of fairies like to take up residence inside the hills in what's called burrs. And even the Native American tribes here in America have their own stories of little people that lived inside the hills and the mountains. The most famous of this would be the hobbits from Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit series by Tolkien. They were little bitty fairies that lived inside of little hobbit holes, which was a little house inside of a hillside. So that's another place that you can find it. The final place you can find fairies is the astral plane. Now, that would probably be the most common place to find a fairy, but the bad news of that is you can't just walk there. It's not a very easy place to get to. A lot of the pagans will call it the inner plane instead of the astral plane. So you might have heard it referred to that way. Now, a lot of people believe that this is where the fairies actually exist. It's a dimension, so to speak, that overlaps ours. It's right on top of us, basically. It exists in the same space that we exist in, but it's in a different dimension. Now, there are various ways to get to the astral plane. One is meditation. You can do so through astral projection. You can do so in your dreams, which is kind of cool. Now, if you're going to try astral projection to try to find fairies or to get to the astral plane, you might want to do a little research on it and make sure you know what you're doing, because in astral projection, you're leaving your body. Your soul is, or your mind, your spirit, whatever, is leaving your body and traveling somewhere else. So if you leave your body and travel to the astral plane, you want to make sure you can get back to your body. You know, I would think that would be pretty important. I'm not exactly sure how that works. I've never been able to leave my body like that. So I don't know if you just get sucked right back in or if there's some process to it. I don't know how it works. So you want to do your research before you do that. There's so many different legends and so many different things about fairies in the folklore. It's really an interesting subject. One thing almost all fairies have in common is they all possess magic, and they all have their own little personalities. None of them are all good, and none of them are all bad. I mean, even something like a troll, which is always bad, even a troll loves its children and wants them to have a better life. That's why it swaps your baby out for its baby so it can have a better life. So there's even a little bit of good to even a troll. Now I'm going to throw over to Old Boy and get his opinions on fairies and leprechauns and all these things, and find out what he thinks about them, whether he believes that they actually exist or if he believes that they're just stories.
And thank you, James. This has always been an interesting story to me. Fairies, leprechauns, it's a great time to do this right now because, you know, St. Paddy's Day is this weekend on Saturday. So if you guys are Irish like me, you're going to celebrate it. We're not going to have, I'm not going to, you know, jump around and get all drunk and do stupid stuff. So I hope any of you guys please be safe if you're Irish. I wanted to throw that part in. But now with leprechauns, I don't believe they're probably leprechauns like people think, like they have them in green and have gold and they smoke pipes and tobaccos and they say, give me your pot of gold, matey. I don't believe that. I think that's all Hollywood, and they don't wear green. It's red, like James was saying in the show earlier, that they're more devious and evil, and I wouldn't trust them with my life. because they're not going to give you 3 wishes, and if they are, they're going to be bad. They're going to come back to you guys like the Wishmaster movie, where you wish on something and you get something opposite. Like you wanted $1 million, well, he turned into $1 million, or you wanted to be the most beautiful woman, so they did, and it got you into the mirror and killed you. I think stuff like that happens, and I think that it's nothing good. And like I was talking about earlier, with iron and silver and stuff like that, I think it hurts them because it's pure metal. It's like with the werewolf with silver. So that means they're a demonic creature of some sort, evil. They're not good. They're not your friends. They're not going to come over and hang out with you and give you gold if you find them at the end of the rainbow. I don't believe that. If they exist, they're not good. They're evil fairies. And we'll get into fairies in a minute, what I think about them. But I don't think there's no good that comes out of leprechauns. I don't know why it became like the Irish mascot, and it's a leprechaun fighting everybody. I don't believe that. If it's anything, it's not good, and it probably has gold. It probably steals it and kills people for it, and it's not a good creature. And it's probably something you don't want to mess with. And with fairies, now that's another story. See, that's a very popular subject with like little kids, and Disney made fairies popular with like Peter Pan and Tinkerbell. You know, she's a cute little fairy, little tough fairy, and does little devious things, but she's not bad. But what I've read, fairies are not good either. Like, they do bad things, they're mischievous, and they do bad things to people. They put spells on them, they take their children and take them to fairyland, and you never see them again. Or they sell them to demons or the devil. Whatever story, that's another legend that happens. I don't believe that either. But I don't believe fairies are little gorgeous little women that fly around with wings and they're really cute. I don't believe that either. I think they're little evil little creatures. Like they look like something you don't want to see coming at you. They're like real small, but they fly around and they bite and pinch and they put spells on you and they do evil things to you. And I just don't think it's something you really want to mess with either. They're not something you want to have at your house. They're not going to come and give you a hug and you go to fairyland and you fly around like it's never world or land and you're going to have fun times. It doesn't happen like that. You're probably going to get tricked into doing something stupid and you're going to die. Like when they were saying you could dance in the circle and they dance you to death, that's what's probably going to happen. They're going to do something to get you to believe it's going to be fun and they're going to kill you in some way. And I think they do that. That's what I think. That's what I think if they exist. I really don't believe they exist, fairies. I think it's some kind of different creature. Maybe it's been exaggerated because they say Slender Man, that was a made-up story, but when we did a show about him and he's a dark fairy, they got the story from that. So there's some truth to every story. Do I think if fairies exist or they're little cute creatures? No. They're probably really bad, just like gnomes and trolls and whatever fairies and whatever, because they're all supposedly fairies, but they're not good. They're not the best creatures to be around. If you ever see like Lord of the Rings, trolls are bad. Labyrinth, the fairies were bad. They weren't nice creatures. They bit you. The gnome was a jerk. He just was greedy and stole stuff. Trolls are, look at Lord of the Rings, they were evil, they were trying to kill the humans like goblins and stuff like that, and leprechauns, look at the movie Leprechaun, like the remake, it's a weird creature, it's like deformed, and it's trying to kill you. I don't believe any of these creatures are your friend, and something you want to really be around or mess around with. Please don't, if these things exist, and I'm going to get to this, I highly doubt they do. I wouldn't go looking for them, or especially looking for a pot of gold, because there isn't any. You're probably going to find, there's nothing at the end of the rainbow. That's all another bunch of Hollywood hogwash, too. So, that's just what I believe. I don't believe any of these things exist. It's really highly doubtful. Now, trolls, maybe. I think they're an evil entity too. I think these are, if they are exist, they're evil, because what I was talking about earlier was silver and metal and iron. That's all pure metal. So that means they don't like it. So that means there's something bad about them. So they're probably not good. And like he was saying earlier about how they sold your kids to the devil or demons, that should tell you right there, fairies are not good. They kidnap your kids. And trolls and changelings, he was talking about that too. They're not good either. They take over the form of your kid, but it's really not them, and they have an appetite that doesn't get quenched. They can even end up eating you and killing you, because that's not their creature. They took the body form of the child. So I don't know what happens to the child. I guess it gets their soul taken or something. That's another story that could be, there goes another evil part of it. And changelings are something I do believe in, but not the way like he was talking about. But I believe there's some some things that can jump into your body and take it over. And there's a lot of stuff you just don't want to mess with. And that's one thing you don't want to do. So, like I said, my opinion is most of this stuff doesn't exist. I think it was made up for St. Paddy's Day and, the Irish folklore and Celtic folklore and Scottish. And I think they did it to tell the children during holidays and when they go to sleep, so they go to sleep and, and so they would be scared not to, if they didn't go to sleep, the fairies would come get them. And I think that's what the truth is about that.
Now for whether I think that fairies actually exist. On the face of it, I would agree with Old Boy, because I would say it seems a little far-fetched and ridiculous. But I try not to prejudge things quickly like that. So let's try to break this down a little bit and discover whether we believe fairies actually exist or not. I said in the beginning that there are literally hundreds of different kinds of fairies. It ranges from trolls to the little Tinkerbell kind of fairies, to leprechauns, to goblins, to hobbits, to all that stuff are technically considered fairies. So let's look at hobbits, for example. Now we know that hobbits did actually exist, because they found remains off the island of Flores in Indonesia in 2003. So we know that hobbits existed in the form of Homo floresiensis, and they were actually, the scientists discovered, related to Homo habilis, which lived in Africa about 1.75 million years ago, so almost 2 million years ago. And that's actually one of the earliest known species of human-like creature that scientists have found. So we know hobbits existed. So since a hobbit in the folklore is considered a fairy, then I would say yes, some fairies exist. Now, do I believe all fairies exist? That's very unlikely that every single version of the fairies exist. Do I believe that only one species of the fairies exist? I think that's probably unlikely too, because you have such a wide variety of creatures that fall under this category. So we know at least one of these species of fairies exist. Therefore, by definition, fairies exist. But not all fairies. Since we know that at least one species of fairies exist, and possibly more, because I'm going to say it's probable that some of these other things exist as well. I mean, I could go through each and every one and give you a ruling on each one of those, but I mean, that'll take 2 or 3 hours to go through every one of them and the reasons why I think they do or do not exist. But let's just say that I believe that multiple creatures in the classification of fairies actually exist. So since that's true, we'll do what I always do on these shows when you're dealing with a dangerous creature. Because remember, as we've talked about in this show, fairies are not cute and cuddly. They are very dangerous. And they can kill you. They can make you miserable. I mean, they could kill you bloody. So let's look at some of the different characteristics of fairies. What they do, what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are, and more importantly, how you can either escape them or banish them or kill them. Now, fairies are a lot like crossroad demons in a way, because they make deals with human beings, a lot of them do. Sometimes the deal is for the firstborn or something like that. Sometimes the deal is for other things. It varies. But we know that they do make deals with human beings. We learned that from the leprechauns dealing for his freedom and all that. And we also know that they can abduct human beings and take them to the fairy realm. We see that in the case of little babies as changelings, when they replace them as changelings. We also know that from the fairy rings, when people get stuck in the fairy rings and they get until they die, and then their mind or their soul or whatever gets taken to the fairy realm. And we know they can abduct humans also. So what can hurt a fairy? Old Boy talked a little bit earlier about iron and silver. Iron and silver are pure metals. They're considered purified. So anything that's evil will not be able to handle iron or silver. It will hurt them. In a lot of cases, silver will actually kill creatures. Now, I don't know for sure whether silver can kill a fairy, but I know that iron will hurt them. And I know that silver will burn fairies severely. I imagine if you plunge the silver knife into its heart, that might kill it. Or maybe you cut its head off, with a silver blade, that might kill it. I'm not sure. Either way you look at it, if you don't have a head, it's going to be awful hard for you to hurt somebody. But fairies are magical creatures, so you never know. A very good way to delay a fairy in order to escape is to spill either salt, which is also purified, or sugar. Now, what happens when you dump salt or sugar in front of a fairy is they must stop whatever they're doing, and they must count every single grain of salt or every single grain of sugar before they can continue what they're doing. Now, I have absolutely no idea why that is. I don't know why they're compelled to count the salt and the sugar. I don't know why they can't do anything other than count the salt and sugar when it's dropped, but I know that throughout folklore they talk about that is a sure way to delay a fairy so that you can escape. So I would say if you are ever in a situation where you are unlucky enough to have a fairy attacking you or after you, that might be a good way to delay it for a while until you can get away. And I guess you could just keep doing that over and over again until you can get away. Now, what do fairies look like? Okay, there's hundreds of different kinds of fairies, so that will vary greatly depending on what kind you're dealing with. But fairies also can take the form of a human being. So you might be talking to a person that's actually a fairy and not even realize it. So that kind of is scary too. Now, some of their powers, their abilities, whatever you want to call it, they're magical creatures. They use magic. They make deals with humans like crossroad demons do. They can become invisible. So the only way you're going to see a fairy is if they want you to see that they're there. Or if you have been to the fairy realm and come back to Earth, then you can see fairies. They can't make themselves invisible to you if you've traveled to the fairy realm before. But I don't know anybody that ever has, so I don't know if that would actually apply, but that's what the folklore says. In the case of things like leprechauns, they have the ability of telekinesis, so they can move objects with their minds. Almost all fairies can teleport as well. They can tell whether you have a soul or don't have a soul, and they can tell the state of your soul. So they can tell if you're a saved person, if they can tell if you're not a saved person, so then your soul is open to be played with. Fairies are immortal, so they don't ever die of natural causes. They have superhuman strength. They can fly, some of them. And some of them also can manipulate reality. So you have, like with leprechauns and the Gilda and a couple others, you have the ability that it's almost like a djinn has, to where they can create reality. So if you make a wish, if you make a deal with a leprechaun where you make a wish that you want something, they can make that thing appear. Now, the weaknesses to fairies. One weakness of fairies is cream. I was saying earlier how you can make an offering of cream to draw the fairies in to get them on your good side. Well, that is a plus, but it's also a weakness as well, because cream reacts to fairies the way that alcohol reacts to us. It gets them drunk. So if they drink enough of it, they'll be drunk. Iron can harm them. Silver, like I said earlier, burns fairies. You have the weakness of the salt and sugar. I talked about that. If the fairies were summoned to our realm through a spell, which is the way that fairies get here sometimes. If that is the case, if you destroy the spell book, then the fairy will be sucked back to the fairy realm and won't be able to mess with you anymore. So those are some of the weaknesses of the fairies, and I would say if you're going to kill a fairy or try to kill a fairy, I think silver would be your best bet. I know silver can burn them, and I know that iron will hurt them. And silver usually kills some of these evil creatures. So if you were in a situation where you need to try to kill a fairy, I would go with silver. And I would either try to plunge a blade into its heart, or I would try to cut its head off. One of those two things, or both. I mean, why not? You're there anyway, you have the silver blade. You might as well stab it in the heart and chop its evil little head off, just to be sure. And then I might even put a big pile of salt and sugar down on the ground beside it, just in case, before I burn it. I mean, I would do everything possible to try to make sure that damn thing didn't come back after me. So there's a couple things that you can do if you need them. I don't think you ever will, because I don't think it's very common for anybody to see or interact with fairies. I think a lot of these other things like demons and like ghosts and stuff like that are a lot more common than fairies are. I think it would be a rather rare experience. Unless, like Old Boy was saying, fairies are demonic entities. Now, if a fairy is actually a demonic entity, then you might be dealing with them a lot more often than you think. But either way, you have the knowledge now to be able to deal with the situation. And with that, we are just about out of time. So we're going to go to the shout-outs. I'm going to let Old Boy do his shout-outs first, and then I'll give mine.
Okay, guys, I want to thank everybody for listening to us on Staring Into the Abyss on Para X. I love you guys. I appreciate all the love we've been getting. We almost got 2,000 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you. Remember, if you want to listen to our old shows, subscribe to James Hershey Jr.'s page. You can find it. He's the bald, big, giant dude on right there. You guys will see him. Really awesome guy. Love doing a show for you guys. Every week it's something different, and I love it. And we're going to keep doing this till we probably die. So you're never going to get rid of us. So every week it's going to be an hour of action. I love you guys. I love my girlfriend, my kid. I want to thank every one of us who supports our show. And we have a patron page if you guys ever want to check it out and do advertising or promotion. If not, you don't want to do it that way, let us know on our Facebooks, James Hershey and James Ash /Oldboy, and instant message us or email us, and we'll tell you information how to do that. I love you guys. Have a great night. And remember, happy St. Paddy's Day, guys. I love you.
And I'd just like to thank everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed this show. We did the show because of St. Paddy's Day coming up. We wanted to do leprechauns, and leprechauns are a version of fairies, or a kind of fairy. So I figured we'd do the whole fairy classification on the show and just have fun with it. And in that vein, as a celebration of St. Paddy's Day and the Irish and Celtic, Scottish, all them peoples, we're going to end the show tonight with a special song from John Hammond, the guy that does our theme song, called Magic Land. So I hope you guys enjoy the song. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for all your support. And until we speak to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. God loves you, and so do we. Enjoy the music. Bye-bye.
Down. took a ride to the other side. Now you see the light, and you don't know why, but you can't deny that you feel so high. With a brand new face in the same old place, but you got a different look now. You can find it out you're about. No one's gonna push you around. Don't you know that you're an angel, brighter than the sun? And it feels so good to be so good to feel so good. With the magic on in your eyes, and it looks so much better. You just turned your play on, fought your fight. Now you change the weather, and it feels so good to be so good to feel so special. And it feels so good to be so good to look so much better. So take a look around. There's so much to see. 'Cause things are getting better for you and me. Yeah.